Good and gracious God, may the words that I speak, the thoughts and insights of our hearts and minds be acceptable to you, you who are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I grew up in the kind of church culture where it wasn't at all unusual after I had come to a new church. After a fairly short amount of time, someone in the congregation would say to me, "So, Pastor, tell me about your call to ministry." And so I would. And because it's a good story, I'll tell you too. I was in high school. I was really into science and math. It was my thing. And I was convinced I was going to go off, hopefully to some good school, and become a scientist. But then in my junior year of high school, something happened that I wasn't expecting. An older man in the congregation began to mentor me in my faith. And I began to grow in my faith pretty dramatically. So that it was no longer my parents' faith that was imposed upon me, it was my faith. And after several months in this area, in this direction, I began to wonder, does God really want me to be a scientist? Nothing wrong with that. That's a good thing to do. But is that really God's plan for my life? And I struggled with that for a number of months. And the only person who knew about the struggle or the issue at all was Doyle, who was my mentor. Wasn't talking to anybody else about it. And finally, after several months, I was just sick of it. I wanted an answer, I wanted direction, I wanted to make a decision. And so one Saturday morning, I was down in my room having my personal devotions, and I did what you're never supposed to do. I laid out the fleece to God. And I said to God, okay, here's the deal. If somebody comes to me in the next week and says, David, I think God might be calling you into the ministry, then I'll take it as a sign that that is your intention and your plan. But if I don't hear from anybody in a week, I'm moving on with my life. And I breathed a big sigh of relief because nobody was talking to me about this. Nobody even knew this was an issue except for Doyle. And so I finished my devotions. I went upstairs. My mom happened to be sitting at the kitchen table having a cup of coffee, and I decided to join her. Now, my mom was a very quiet person. She didn't talk a lot about anything, and she certainly didn't talk much about her faith. But after "Good morning, David," the first thing out of her mouth was, "David, I'm not sure why I'm saying this, but I'm really wondering if maybe God has called you to be a minister." True. And I was so shook up. I could not speak. I could not get my act together. And finally, just to make an excuse to get away and to collect myself, I said, I'm going to go out and check the mailbox and see if we have any mail. So I did. And lo and behold, there's a letter from my Uncle Harrison, who lives 1,000 miles away in Wisconsin, and his wife, Koba. And it's a nice letter. Harrison and I had always had a good relationship, but I hadn't seen him or even talked to him for 2 or 3 years. And I read the letter, and I get to the last paragraph of the letter. And Uncle Harrison says, "David, I know I haven't seen you in a long time, we haven't talked, but I just get this sense that maybe God is calling you into ministry." Twice in 10 minutes. And Uncle Harrison wrote that letter several days before I laid down the fleece and gave God my edict. And that, as they say, is the rest of the story. So often when I have told this story to someone who has asked me to share it, I get done and I look them straight in the eye and I say, okay, now Mark, tell me about your call to ministry. And usually what I get is a gape open mouth and bugged out eyes. And no response. I guess only ministers are supposed to have calls to ministry. The Bible teaches us a good deal about God's call upon us, God's call to each of us. And three things I'd like to highlight this morning that I believe the Scriptures tell us about call. The first is that call is covenantal. Call is covenantal. Now, what does that mean? It means that if you are a child of God, if you believe you are a part of the family of God, you are called. No exceptions. Peter, who was starring in both of the scripture lessons that we read for you this morning, wrote in 1 Peter 2 to the people of God. He said, "You are a holy people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, that you may declare the wonderful deeds of him who called you out of darkness and into his wonderful light." Each of you, Peter says, is called to share the incredible impact that your relationship with God has had on your life. How having a relationship with God has moved you out of darkness and toward the light. If you are a people of God, if you are a child of God, God's called you to do that. No exceptions. So that's number one. The call is covenantal. The call is comprehensive. It applies to each and every one of us. Secondly, the call is compelling. The call is compelling. Read the stories of the Bible. Read the stories of those who were called by God. Remember Jonah and the whale? Remember Jonah's desperate efforts to ignore God's call and to walk the other way? You remember how far it got him? You remember Moses and the burning bush? You remember Abraham? You remember Jesus? You remember Peter? You remember John? And a whole list of others who were called, and God would not let them go. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't an opportunity. It wasn't a volunteer possibility. It was a call. A few years ago, National Public Radio did an interview with Richard Branson. He's, of course, the owner of Virgin Airlines and is a multi-millionaire at this point. Richard came from very humble roots. And after he made it big, he decided he wanted to give back. He wanted to make a difference. And that's why they were interviewing him. And at one point, the interviewer said to Richard Branson, "So Richard, Do you feel like you were called to do this work? And Richard thought for a moment and said, nah. He said, I feel like I was lucky. I feel like if there are any gods up there anywhere, they may have smiled down on me. I feel like I got some great breaks. I feel like I want to pay it forward. But do I feel like I was called, like I had some responsibility to do this? No, not so much. Well, we're glad that Richard Branson decided to pay it forward. But a call is very different from that. A call is more than that. A call is believing that it is in the very DNA of your life. It is as if you are convinced that God has given you a gift, that God has given you a passion, and that you are therefore called by God, impelled, almost compelled, to use that gift in a way that makes a difference. The call is covenantal. The call is compelling. And finally, the call is continual. It's not a one-shot thing. You heard Julie read about Peter and his call at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. Come and follow me. Peter said yes. He answered the call. But 3 years later, a whole lot of water has gone over the dam. And Peter's in a very different place. In fact, in that scripture that I read for you, Peter has denied Jesus. And Peter has gone back to the fishing boats. It looks very much as if he's decided to go back to his old way of living. And it is on the shores that day that Jesus once again comes to Peter and calls him a second time. It's as if to say to Peter, that call I made upon you 3 years ago hasn't changed. That yes you gave me 3 years ago should not have changed. If you still love me, Peter, follow me. If you still love me, feed my sheep. Now, it's my personal experience. I told you about my first call to ministry when I was 17 years old. But there have been at least 3 other times in my life where God has clearly redefined the call, reaffirmed the call, perhaps reshaped the call, reinforced the call, but made it clear to me that God still had a plan for my life and for the way that I would live it. I think that's true for each of us if we're open, if we're listening. So the questions for us this morning, I think, are, what is God calling you to do, to be? Based on your gifts and your passions and your understanding of Scripture and the people around you who give you feedback, what is God calling you to be? Secondly, what will that call look like at this stage of your life? It may well look quite different than it did at 20 or 40 or 50 or 60. How are you going to use those gifts and that passion? How are you going to live out that call here and now? And then finally, of course, the last question is, how will you respond? How will you answer? It's my hope, and it's my prayer, that each one of us will answer in the words of the hymn that we are about to sing.